Really happy to be here. It's my third time in MPC. Um, Great session, great panel today. But let me ask you a show of hands. How many of you actually fully understand blockchain, its impact, its disruptive powers? I've been doing this since 2011. And if you don't, this is a perfect session because we're going to uncover those secrets that you've been always wanting to know but were afraid to ask. So my name is Nitin. I serve as Director of Blockchain Labs. This topic is near and dear to my heart. I've been at this since 2011, and I'm in the process of building a cross-border payment network on blockchain platform. I've been spending a lot of time in capital markets, so the entire financial services sector, and figuring out as to how blockchain fits in disruptive and transformative ways. But today's panel is really interesting. I think we have two amazing sort of entrepreneurs, innovators. I'm the enterprise guy, and we have a lawyer. It's always good to have a lawyer in these conversations to be able to intersect between various facets of the business. I will lay out a few thematic elements. Of course, this is tech, which means blockchain itself is a quite complicated tech. We've oversimplified it over time, but I'll spend some time in understanding the technical facet. That's one angle. We'll talk about business models, which is a huge, huge challenge because it's not about a single entity using blockchain. And the third element is legal aspect. How many of you heard of Libra? I'm publishing a paper in about a week in figuring out as to what it surfaces for us. So this is going to be an intersection of business, tech, and legal, and trying to be able to paint a picture. So hopefully this next 40 minutes is going to be power-packed. And with that, please allow me to welcome my esteemed colleagues, Sean, Zach, and Angela. Please join me on the stage, and we'll kick this off. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves and what they do. And then eventually we'll go into some of the questions. I've planned a few questions. Let's keep this interactive. It's really your session. I do this for a living, so it's not really exciting for me, besides the fact that the question that I get from you. From that perspective, I'll start with you, Sean. Would you like to take a few minutes to introduce yourself?
Fantastic. Thanks, Nitin. Hi, everyone. My name's Sean Bennett. I am co-founder and CTO at Stronghold. I've been in the blockchain space since 2011, 2014. I started a company that essentially moved traditional value on top of blockchain. We now like to call that stablecoins. At Stronghold, what we're really doing is taking blockchain technology where there's not that many transactions going through, not that much money actually moving through it today, but very interesting technology. Traditional world, that's where all the money is moving through, but some of the technology in there is getting a bit old. We're essentially taking the good bits out of blockchain, the bits we think are good, de-risking them, making sure they're appropriate for use in enterprise setting, and getting those into the traditional legacy systems.
So as a plugin, I've been working with Sean almost a year and a half. We're using, in the payment network that we are building, IBM Worldwide, which is cross-border payment, we're trying to utilize stablecoin in that system. More on that topic in a few minutes, but how many of you recognize the accent? You get an extra sandwich for that? What accent is that?
It better be Australian, or I'm very confused.
Ooh.
New Zealand.
Yes, yep, I'm a Kiwi, New Zealand.
All right. We'll talk to you later about that.
I'm getting this close enough.
Zach.
Sure. So I'm Zach Xia, CEO and co-founder of PundiX. So PundiX is actually a blockchain company that is focused on hardware. So we built two kinds of hardware. One is point of sale solutions, and the other one is a mobile phone. So on top of both solutions, we have our own blockchain solutions and also our own blockchain. So we are actually a blockchain startup. We went through the ICO craze in 2017 and 18. So now we have 8 offices around the world. So I think today I'd like to learn more about how blockchain can coincide with the payment space, especially in US.
Excellent. Any guess on where he's from? We have a truly international panel here. Come on, guess. Singapore.
Yeah.
All right.
Close enough, yeah.
Close enough.
Close enough. It's in Asia somewhere.
Malaysia, so yeah.
All right.
I am Angela Angelowska-Wilson. I am a co-founder of DLX Law, which is a specialty boutique that specializes in all the various legal issues related to blockchain. And I typically do not have such grand entrance into my speaking engagements. I was previously a partner at spent most of my career in Big Law, Latham & Watkins and Reed Smith. And then kind of caught the early on bug, started in 2012 in Bitcoin. Got very excited about the potential of new rails for payment systems, and then was part of the founding team and the chief legal officer of Digital Asset Holdings, which is one of the earliest blockchain enterprise software development companies.
Good. I am very familiar with DH. I think we had some early work with Digital Asset Holding.
And an investment into it.
Anybody wants to guess where Angela's from? Come on, give it a guess. All right. You want to tell us where you're from?
Former Yugoslavia.
Okay, great. So I was first thinking of actually posing all the technical questions with lawyers and having all the legal questions for the technical guys. It'd be a good mix of things, but I figured out in the interest of time and utilizing the space. I'll start with you, Sean. It's going to be a technical question because it's CTO. How do you see blockchain, regardless of the specific framework, as we know there are 800 plus different technologies and still evolving, emerge either in replacing or running in parallel the existing incumbent payment systems? And while you're at it, feel free to opine on some of the technical challenges, including scalability, security, adoption, and so on and so forth.
Sure, great. So I think what I'm pleased to be seeing out in the industry now is we don't have this sort of approach where blockchain is just being inserted anywhere it can be, right? Just taking this big hammer and pounding away at square pegs into round holes. What I think we're really seeing now is more of a view of what are the actual problems that the businesses we're trying to place blockchain into facing, and then designing very specific products which may or may not include blockchain, and to what extent include blockchain is varying as well, to really just solve problems, right? I think still we see some projects that really were an inappropriate use of blockchain, and I think there was an attempt to maybe disrupt too much at once. There's certainly catalysts that will, result in replacing entire value chain, rails with blockchain from day one. Really interested to hear about how that is on the retail side, with customers bringing cryptocurrency, right, which is, very much separate to blockchain as a payment rail potentially. So at Stronghold, most of the time when we're moving value for payments on top of blockchain technology, it's traditional currency. It's some sort of token or unit of measure that is a US dollar, a New Zealand dollar, right? Not necessarily a new store of value like Bitcoin or Ethereum is. So what I think really is the most appropriate, inclusion of blockchain technologies in payments today is the parallel approach, right? Find an area where there is a need that the business has that blockchain can be solving. Place blockchain in there as an option, right? And there's no need to, force a huge integration effort, huge technology builds onto, incumbent players and businesses. There are certainly ways that blockchain can be used to transfer value, whether that is a stable coin or a cryptocurrency. But the businesses, the incumbents, the banks, can still see those payments going through as something that looks a bit more traditional, right? So maybe it is, sending value through on the Stellar blockchain network, but the banks are seeing ISO 20022 payments, right? So there's much less integration effort for them to need there. And if this particular method of sending money is available to them as an option, then let them choose, okay, we have our traditional rails, we have this blockchain-based rail that still looks quite, traditional from my point of view as someone in the bank. And if it is indeed cheaper, faster, safer, more, better transparency, data, auditability, great, I'll choose to use that. And then maybe over time that succeeds and more of the value moves over there and it ends up replacing it. Fantastic. But right now, I think it is just too difficult to be going into these organizations and trying to get them to replace, an entire value chains. But unfortunately, we still see a little bit of that occurring.
So this notion of convergence, right? As I'm building network, as you look at the entire notion of Swift being displaced or Swift themselves having Project Ripple is trying to aim to displace Swift, we're building WorldWire from a perspective of cross-border payments. I think what we begin to see is the converged agenda is an expensive one for clients, which is that how do you ensure that you have two parallel transaction systems addressing the same segment of market. And I believe that in some cases, the integration challenges are much more, sort of profound challenge for enterprises because they're not just dealing with adapting to the ISO 20022, but also integrating these newer systems that are coming up online with their treasury management, cash management systems. So, as you build upon this, do you encounter, like, what is the silver bullet from a technology perspective for adoption path to ensuring that we are keeping the incumbent systems alive because they are still bread and butter of many organizations, and yet embarking on the transformation that these technologies bring about?
I think the important thing there is really making sure that we're working with those incumbent players to, include adoption of these new parallel run systems, right? It's very much the case that, everything Stronghold does today requires the depository institution. How do you on and off ramp money between where all of it is today, where the retail, users have the money, the businesses, and some sort of digital ledger? How do you cross that divide? One of the main ways that we see it done today through the use of stablecoins is money is deposited at a bank or some other FI and represented on ledger. So I think that, intrinsic to a lot of the products that are being deployed, the incumbents are a major part of it.
Right.
And I think working with them is probably the best approach.
So let me actually, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, because I always cause trouble, so that's one of my
Lawyers,
roles.
you can expect that.
So, we talk about some of the systems, but what about the availability and ability to use some of the blockchain systems in P2P payments and P2P networks, and how does that impact some of the issues that we are talking about, the treasury management and some of the, basically cutting out some of the traditional financial institutions that are sitting in the middle between the different treasury management systems?
Yeah, I think for P2P, it's a very interesting one. I think the problem right now is, what is the unit of value that we are transferring P2P, right? If we have something like a stable coin, that's money held at a bank. If we're using Bitcoin, okay, now I can on and off ramp it, maybe a cryptocurrency exchange, but now I'm facing currency risk. How am I going to account for that as a business or even as a individual user? There's a lot of problems with reporting to the IRS. How do I deal with that? And I think that we may see some better stores of value that bypass the traditional FIs come into existence over time, but we're not quite there yet, at least for businesses to adopt.
I would turn around and ask this question to you, Angela. That like CP19, FCA passed CP19 yesterday. FINMA, which is in Switzerland, passed
Yes.
a paper on payment directive. The MiFID. There's a whole slew of regulatory framework that deals with the payment service providers, what you call virtual asset service providers. The notion of P2P, like if I were to give you money, it's still okay. But if I were to go through an entity that needs to digitize the whole element of the transfer, still a regulated activity, right?
Correct.
So how do you define from a legal purview this notion of movement of an asset from point A to point B, whether it's a peer-to-peer or a peer-to-peer enabled by a network?
So I knew I would get in trouble by asking questions. Like any other systems, when we talk about payments, I would say the basis, the foundations of any payment system has always been and will be the legal underpinnings and ability to have a well understood, transparent legal position as to how things, especially payment finality and settlement, are going to actually, occur, and where that payment is no longer able to go back, and there is a settlement finality. And in P2P systems, and depending on what are some of the assets that are being transferred, and of the networks that are actually helping that process of transferring, there is a lot of legal uncertainty as to what legal and regulatory regimes are governing the various participants in the system. So in a typical P2P system, there is no regulation that stops me from being able to give you cash and now I'm transferring that into the digital era, and then it's like, wait, are we going back to the 90s where we are talking about, are internet services part of the regulation of the phone companies? Are they coming under the, some of the regulatory frameworks that existed for the actual pipes, right?
Yeah.
And what happens then? So we have a lot of regulatory uncertainty, which I think is hindering some of those
It depends
developments.
on what you pay me for, car or cocaine. It completely have the whole legal element. Zach, let me move the focus to you, coming from Pundi and the work that you're doing in sort of making sort of crypto available to the masses, right? Eventually, we do aspire to get this fungible unit in the system, and there's a lot of confusion in terms of crypto and fungibility of crypto itself. So from your vantage point, any thoughts on the business structure, either transforming the agenda of the incumbents or disrupting the incumbents? Because at some point, if you're trying to create the parallel infrastructure in the context we had before, someone's got to pay for it, someone's got to monetize it, and you're at the periphery of this, trying to figure out as to what's the best path. By the virtue of you creating this infrastructure, you're dealing with crypto and eventually crypto adjuncts like stable coins.
Sure. I think we are looking at this from the basis of we think that blockchain will be pervasive in the whole industry. So whether it's in payment industry or in any industry. So I think we are starting from this standpoint of a rollout. So say for example, 20 years ago, when we were doing IT integration, so we transfer from spreadsheet to database. So people were talking about what kind of database we want to implement. Was it IBM DB2? Was it SQL and etc.? So I think blockchain itself will reach that stage whereby whether you are a big bank, whether you are Citibank, Wells Fargo, or whether if you are a mom and pop shop, most of the people, if not all, will be in blockchain. So I think the question is when will we make the leapfrog? It could be something that is very revolutionary, but it could be also evolutionary, whereby things happen slowly. So I think in the industry right now, there's two school of thoughts. One is that we want to be very revolutionary, whereby we want to make the leap, whereby we want to abandon old technology and use new technology. This is one school of thought. But there's actually another school of thought whereby why don't we use both technology at the same time? So I can use spreadsheet and I can also use database, right? So both systems are actually existing at the same time. So for example, when we talk about Facebook, Facebook is not abandoning their database. They still have their database. They have their cloud database, they have their servers, but they're also working on Libra, so to speak. So I think both can actually exist in parallel. And many big companies or many forward-looking companies are actually rolling out this kind of technology in parallel. So it's not like I want to abandon what I have, but to start testing out at the same time. So I think this is the prevalent school of thought in some big companies that I think will work well.
Let me have a follow on that again, sticking to the business theme here. Crypto assets, tokenized fiat, stable coins aim to speed the settlement cycle, right? That's the intent of some of these tokenized assets, trying to solve the last mile problem, trying to figure out as to, what are the, and the notion of embracing blockchain technology again is to be able to truly create this digital transaction system. So from your vantage point, what are the impediments when you begin to see, at least from your vantage point, because you're dealing with cash, you're dealing with crypto, you're dealing with sort of an exchange model, the convergence of tech, your business model, and legal elements. Because depending on whether it's a commodity versus security versus how or utility coin, they all have different classifications, and you happen to be dealing with all of them. Any thoughts on the challenges that you see through?
Yeah, very good question.
Of course it is.
Because
Go ahead, sorry.
because we are working on a lot of last mile. So what we do is that we allow people to acquire cryptocurrency or use cryptocurrency in mom and pop's convenience store and etc. So in every jurisdiction that we go in, we struggle with the legality of it, because in most jurisdictions there isn't a legality. So how do we treat cryptocurrency? So we actually try to treat it as close as possible to the legal standard that it has. So if a country, if a jurisdiction doesn't have definition of a cryptocurrency, then we will take a look at remittance. We will take a look at stored value license. So these are like the closest thing that we have. So take, for example, a person will not be able to transfer anonymously, say more than $300 on the card. So can we use that reference, that framework to deploy it on the jurisdiction? So we try to fit it as close as possible. And the challenge for us is that we are in 30 countries. So we are in Venezuela, we're in Japan, Singapore, different places. So different governments actually treat it very differently. So I think one of the key things that we need to solve in every single market is figuring out how to deploy in a legal and compliant way.
Right. So before I move to Angela, because I know she's itching to respond to this question, but you got to hold your horses, Angela. Is U.S.
Yeah.
a complex landscape, and the only reason why I have gray hair is dealing with some of the regulatory bodies and figuring out what we need to do with crypto. You talked about Asia, Korea, Japan, Venezuela, out of all places. What is your perspective on the United States?
So because of how impactful SEC is, so regardless of if a company is operating in US, we all have to reference SEC stand. So for Puniax, we are not very present in US, but I believe every single company has to reference SEC's standard, because I think there's a rule in SEC saying that, if you are servicing an
Any
American citizen, then you are sort of like tied to the SEC.
So I can use Fundy point of sale system, is that what you're telling me?
Yes, you can. So we go through the compliance process. So for an American citizen to use our service, we will have a layer of services. So there are certain services that we are not 100% sure an American can use. So we stop at that. But the foundation of the service, whereby you provide the POS system for people to buy and sell crypto or use crypto, is possible in US.
And
So
what
it's just a
what if I
given.
have, I made this question for you.
Yeah.
I have 2 passports, I'm dual citizen. How do you bypass that process? But before we go to that piece, Angela, I'd like to get your opinion on the alignment of the legal
It
framework.
depends which passport you submit.
That's true. Let's say I don't use my American passport, I'm still governed with the same legal framework. So the question then for you, Angela, is, and I've been dealing with a lot of regulatory bodies to get clearance for our own work that we're doing, but just want to get you the impact of the entire legality, which is enormously complex today because classification is still up in the air. How do you reconcile that with the business priorities and the cost structure? Because what I've seen, and we discussed this before we came for this, is the mounting legal cost, even just going to business, which is the whole, defeats the purpose of why we want to go blockchain, because it's supposed to reduce the legal cost. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, I don't think blockchain is supposed to reduce the legal costs just yet. No new system ever does that. So, I mean, the legality, like I said, one of the fundamental things in financial services is kind of the regulatory and legal framework, because we are dealing with money. It's something that people really do care about and do want to understand what happens to it. And so, the different classifications around the world and the different treatment of cryptocurrencies arise, a lot of it actually arises from people not understanding on both sides, the regulators as well as the technologies. How do we really interface between regulation and technology? One of the things that I always try to tell all my techie friends is, look, the regulators are not there to actually regulate the technology. What they regulate are the principles and the type of transaction that you're engaging in. And so if I really don't like it when people say well, there is no regulation on the books on this, because it's all new, it's all crypto, it's never been done before. And I have to go back and say well, way back when in the 50s, you didn't know what a credit card slip and what were some of the legal ramifications and the standings of that, and how did that work through the system. You did have principles and you did have certain underlying legal basis on which you made your decisions of how something was treated. and then all of that got, settled both through adoption, market practices, as well as, through the court system. And we are seeing that all over the world again. The challenge with this technology is that it's very difficult to pinpoint where does the buck stop? Where does the regulator point to, push in order to stop something that is not possible to stop? And that is really the challenge on the legal front.
Got it. So for the audience, I think if you look at the challenge in the US, we have either commodities or, in case of securities, SEC or CFTC. And then you have this utility coin, which is not regulated because it's like paying a toll to use a toll road. The incumbent challenge that we're talking about is the classification of the different types of token in the system, which has its own sort of legacy and its own sort of burden of that regulation. So I want to switch back for a minute because it's pertinent to the technology, Sean, back to you, is we talk about interoperability, the notion of a token type, which is either used as a medium of exchange or asset exchange mechanism. As it traverses across the system, can you enlist some of the technical challenges that is sort of plaguing our industry in terms of a token is a commodity, but suddenly it becomes, a utility? And the interoperability between networks, what are the technical challenges that you see with that in the stablecoin context?
Sure. To talk to interoperability first, I think that one of the big issues we had earlier on, and maybe it certainly looks like it's being solved for now, is the smart contract piece, right? That enables you to write, essentially software programs that live on the blockchain. And they might be able to operate themselves, right, autonomously. And that kind of relates back to that problem of how does the regulator even treat something like that? There is no, there may not be an entity to target for regulation. Unfortunately, the problem with those was that we were having, software developers that might not have had financial or payments experience writing smart contracts that moved money around. And we saw, unfortunately, some quite substantial financial losses occur because of that, right? So now what we're seeing people building are, easier smart contract tools that might be visual, so you can have business stakeholders, legal experts audit them a little bit more easily instead of having to train, lawyer software developers to parse through code. And some of those smart contract tools are able to deploy that, that logic onto multiple blockchains. So, if you needed to, you could switch between some of the various protocols you were using. As well as that, there are a lot of protocols, blockchain tools that are being developed, and their sole purpose is to transfer value between some of these disparate systems, right? And there's actually some non-blockchain tools, Interledger is a good example, I think, that came out of Ripple, that it is used as a messaging system that could interact with, you could have just normal bank ledgers over here, you could have, Bitcoin, Ripple, whatever. It doesn't matter anymore as long as you know something about that end user. You send your payment into the system and it routes it to the right place. So there are certainly tools targeting interoperability from a development point of view, but even if you want to have multiple ledgers survive in the future, you might not need to know what ledger the other person runs, right? And it's the case when you're sending money. A lot of the time, you won't know what core banking system XYZ bank happens to use. You don't care. There's some standard to transfer the value, and it gets, settled and cleared there.
All right, cool. If you guys really want to have fun, get a blockchain developer and a blockchain lawyer in a room, and it's a lot of fun just having this conversation. I've gone through that myself. Switching to the legal facet of this, right? Let's address the Libra effect, right? And I use that word. I'm actually extensively researching in terms of the impact on that on the overall payment and settlement industry. Is a lot of legal and regulatory framework surrounding blockchain payments, including the spectrum of whether it's security settlement versus payments, remittances, as a whole slew of the payment landscape in general. We've surfaced in broader terms. I just want to understand, as a lawyer, as a legal counsel, what is your overall approach to navigating this landscape? Because even many of us who are technical at heart and still are forced to understand the legal ramification of some of these things, what is your approach, and how do we sort of take that approach as a sort of a gospel of sorts, at least in today's context, and navigate that ecosystem?
Yeah, so just like the technical people have had to learn all the legal stuff, I also do a lot of the technical stuff. Way back when I actually started as a webmaster, so I am dangerous enough to be able to write some smart contracts, and I'm not sure that they're smart or a contract, but that's a different story. So like I said, one of the fundamental things that I think about is really having to understand what the product is and what does it do and how does it do it. And so there are, I'm going to say that 7 out of 10 times, what we are seeing is, a cryptocurrency that is standing in for a security, or it is standing in for a commodity, or it's standing in for money. And when I look at those, projects, I start with the principles that apply to the security space. And when something is a security, we do have a regulatory framework to address some of it. Now, the fun really becomes, it's not really interesting. Those 7 are not that interesting because just about everybody can figure out where they're going to fit in at the end of the day if they look close enough under the hood. It's those 3 that are blurring the lines, and they are in certain circumstances they are playing the role of commodity, a gold, a store of value, or they're playing the role of stable coins, or they're playing the roles of securities based on what the project is doing. And so I can look at the project and I can say, okay, this project started out as a security because the way that they ran the fundraising options, the way that, the very beginning of it was very much a security. What I don't know is what's the magic dust? What's the point in time when something stops being that and transfers into a different regulatory regime because it is now a payment system?
Right.
That's where really the key becomes, and that's what makes it really fun from a legal perspective.
No, I think that's a really interesting insight, and maybe I'll give it back to Zach for a minute in terms of traversing the crypto asset becoming a payment instrument. In your vantage point, some of the business challenges around cost structure, not to mention the fact that you need to have your legal basis covered. And then maybe, Sean, you can expand on your experience with stablecoin, because me and you are living this in launching a stablecoin in the network. So maybe, Zach, you go first for a few minutes, and then maybe, Sean, you can take it from there.
Sure. So I think the legal and the compliance is definitely a huge cost for a startup, because you have to service like different countries, and SEC is definitely, we need to service SEC regardless of whether we are in US. So I think this is one cost. The second is that for our business, because we are working on the last mile, so we started by producing point of sales. So we started by producing point of sales, and we ended up accidentally positioning ourselves as a point of sales a player, but that is actually not our intent. So we kind of like change the positioning in the recent months, whereby we try to get the existing point of sales company, Verifone, Ingenico, and etc., to use our service. So by tapping onto their network, we can supply more cryptocurrency purchase opportunity, or allow people to use crypto to buy things offline.
But don't you become an exchange then?
We do not see ourselves as an exchange, because there are other elements in an exchange that makes it more complicated. So we see ourselves as a ATM, a Bitcoin ATM, but smaller and easier. So for someone to use a Bitcoin ATM, the cost would be $5,000 to $10,000 to get a Bitcoin ATM. But for our POS device, is $300 US. And again, our position is to move away from a hardware production standpoint to a software provider, basically servicing the offline market. And we believe it's very interesting because we actually have two categories of the market. One is the advanced category, so markets like Switzerland, Singapore, Dubai. And we have another category, which is what we call the other category, which is Venezuela, Argentina, and etc. So it is actually the former that was like more interesting, whereby they picked up the offerings much earlier.
Yeah.
But actually, it was the later that got really, really interesting, whereby people were actually very curious to replace the government fiat. Yeah, as you know.
Sean, less than a minute. What's your thoughts on the same challenges from a stronghold and stablecoin perspective?
Yeah, in terms of cryptocurrencies, we're very careful on what we touch. So, as far as, blockchain startups go, we don't really touch that many assets just to play it safe. We've got enough, legal headaches elsewhere. In terms of operating in the US, partner, right? Just partner with, companies that were probably traditional to start with, but have, taken a step into the blockchain arena, right? So we don't transfer any of the funds ourselves. We have a partner company to do that. Custody is a big issue, I think, that a lot of people
Yeah.
are overlooking. A lot of the time they're pretending, oh, we're not really touching the funds. It's going through really quickly, or, oh, we're not really holding any money. You're certainly taking custody of it. So at least in the US, we have a trust company to do that for us, right? So we're able to get ourselves out of some of those concerns. I think the biggest regulation that hits us, because we're still seeing the money flows, is AML,
And FinCEN,
right? Yeah.
Excellent. So I'm sure you should have questions. Because if you don't have questions, you won't pay attention. Please go ahead.
Will Bitcoin be a future in which we could be paying any person, anywhere, at any time?
I do it today. But I'll let the panels answer that. Sorry.
I think for me, it's just a matter of time, and we do see that. So, say for example, last week, the biggest departmental store in Venezuela is starting to accept cryptocurrency in most of their stores. So I think it's just a matter of time and form that it takes. It could be Bitcoin, it could be stable coin. So I think it's just a matter of time, and it happens. Yeah.
So then, if you're paying people with Bitcoin and being paid, you're also a securities trader.
I'll let the lawyer answer the question. I have an opinion on that, but let the lawyer answer the question.
So
No,
how
not
do you
for
decide
Bitcoin.
Whether you want to pay them in Bitcoin or cash? You must make that.
I'll let her answer, and I'll give a technical / business opinion on that.
Yeah, on Bitcoin actually is one of the very few currencies out there that the
Yes, yeah.
SEC
It's not regulated.
has not taken a stance with respect to regulation. And so it is considered to be non-security.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's a utility, and the Ethereum, Bitcoin are two sort of accepted utilities, and also any currency is a belief system. And in many cases, when people claim that, look, it's very tracking and tracing, which is a plus and minus of Bitcoin, is a hard thing. So in terms of classifying as security, I think that's something still the jury's out. But if you have something riding on Bitcoin, then has a promise, the whole Howey test, which is still an antiquated system, I think, could be potential security, at least from some of the conversation that we're having in terms of what rides on a Bitcoin or on a crypto asset per se.
But if I buy something from you and you pay me in Bitcoin, you must think that the Bitcoin price is going down.
I can pay you with a bushel of corn.
Not necessarily, because the very initial time, Bitcoin was created for a payment system, and this, digital gold, store the value, is really a narrative that started out later, which is really interesting because people say that the early adopters were, the hold it. That's not true. The early adopters, you wanted to actually use it as a payment system.
Tax is
Yeah.
a whole different question on that.
Yeah.
So
and-
Oh,
taxation-
absolutely.
Tax is a whole different thing.
Very recently, New Zealand's Inland Revenue Department, so the IRS analog, ruled that cryptocurrency could be used for wages and
That's right.
salary.
No, that's right.
And what they were really going for there was the less volatile and the more the crypto looked like money. They're not going to say it's money, right? It's still property. the more they'd be willing to accept that was, you know, a normal wage or salary payment. So they're really looking at stable coins.
Yeah.
But you know, that might be the start of actual legalization as opposed to this grey area payment that goes on today.
Any more questions?
As it relates to, you mentioned tracking and tracing and essentially knowing the parties that are giving and receiving. How do you think the highly punitive regulatory standards like OFAC
Yeah.
and things like that will have to evolve when it seems like it just seems like a very punitive and risky sort of regulatory
So
standard?
there's a lot of work at technical level, and I'll let Angela answer the legal facet of it. Chain analysis, IBM itself, we're doing anti-money laundering from a fraud and financial services perspective, which is using machine learning and AI to be able to detect the movement of money. And so there's a lot of ability for us to be able to figure out as to which wallet is transferring money to which wallet, where they're located geographic, you know, in terms of geography. I think the challenge is pinpointing exactly who the individual is. So recently, FINMA, which is Switzerland, FISMA in the US, FCA, FinCEN, they all have had a sort of guidance in terms of the fact that if anybody's involved in moving this money, they're required to have, whether it's 5 AMLD, which is the European laws, or AML in our cases, have to be implemented in identifying the KYC elements of the two. But there's a lot of work happening in the space at its technical level to be able to pinpoint, identify individuals who are receiving, spending, and transferring money, regardless of their identity attached to the wallets per se. That leads to one last question. I'll shut up and I'll have Angela answer it. Is the element of identity, which is a really critical piece in blockchain world, that I cannot assign an asset to a driver's license or a passport. I need to have a digital version of you in the system.
Well, I think one of the things that just like there's a lot of technical work that is happening on being able to identify the wallets and kind of trace, because remember, everything is really publicly available. So it's not anonymous, it's pseudonymous. It's like an email. You can see where the email went through, like who forwarded what. You just don't know who's sitting behind it because all you're looking at is, you know, blonde girl, whatever, at Gmail, right? You don't know who really is sitting behind it. Just like there's a lot of technical work on that front, there's actually a lot of technical work to obfuscate and to do to stop some of that work, and that's the privacy coins. So that's your using proof of work. Not proof of work.
Zero knowledge proof?
Zero knowledge proofs. Thank you. Yeah, I'm like spacing out because I'm trying to be fast. So zero knowledge proofs and a lot of other privacy coins like Monero and others that are actually using technical solutions to move away from the ability to do that.
Yeah. So we're already a minute and a half. I just want to thank you for your time, your patience. Please give a huge round of applause to this talented panel that we have here. And we'll be around, so catch us and talk to us.
Yes.